Streaming. Okay. Oh, it looks like we're already live. Okay. I've never gone live directly before. Usually I schedule it in advance, so I was kind of caught off guard there. Okay. Hi everyone. How are you doing today? This is just an impromptu live stream, which I was going to do like last week and just wasn't feeling up to it. And really, I don't think this will be like a normal live stream because I'm planning just to share my thoughts on Crime and Punishment Part 1. It's a longish book, really. It's I want to say it's like 600 pages. I don't know if the print copy is that long, but my ebook copy says it's 600 something pages. So, yeah, it's a chunkster, and I thought it'd be fun, as I usually do with these longer books on my blog. I thought it would be fun to go through it part by part and discuss, what I'm thinking as I'm reading it, my reactions. And I realize it's not the most ideal time to be live streaming. The only reason I'm doing it this way is because I wanted to not feel pressured to edit because I've been really short on time lately. But yeah, so without further ado, let's just get into it here. There are going to be minor spoilers. I'm going to go over the entirety of part 1 and my reactions to it, plot developments, all of that good stuff. So yeah, bear with me. I don't really have a lot of notes here, just a bunch of scattered things. So we will see how it goes, but let me just pull up the Wikipedia article here. I'm going to really be relying on Wikipedia for my outline, so to speak, because I didn't come up with one for this live stream, but that's okay. We're just gonna roll with it. So part 1 introduces us to this character. Let me get my keyboard out of the way. We won't need that for a while. So part 1 introduces us to our protagonist, Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. And I am sure I'm going to completely mess up many of these pronunciations, so just bear with me or correct me if you like. And actually, just as an aside, I'm reading the Constance Garnett translation. I'm reading this with my brother, so I wanted to make sure it was a translation we both had access to, and one that my brother could also get on audiobook easily, because he likes to listen to the audiobook as well. And I like Garnett. I mean, she was, I think, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, English translator of many of the Russian classics. And even though her translations may seem dated to us now, I think her impact was enormous, and I think they still read very well, especially given they were, not so long after the writing of the original books, that she wasn't using completely contemporary or anachronistic vocabulary. So I appreciate that about Constance Garnett. But anyway, let's see. So yeah, chapter 1 of part 1 introduces us to Raskolnikov, a student or ex-student who is living in dire straits. He's in St. Petersburg. He has no money to speak of. He's in debt to his landlady, and he is completely miserable. Unfortunately, he has fastened on to this idea, this germ of an idea, to murder this pawnbroker that he knows. So not his landlady, but this other elderly woman who is quite stingy, very much a Scrooge kind of character, and somebody he's interacted with in the past, pawning off his father's watch and other valuables to this woman. And he knows that she has a lot of money. He knows she's a very unpleasant character, and he believes that if he were to get up the resolve to murder her, he could steal her money and profit from that. So that's kind of what he's been ruminating on in his days of unemployment, having no work, no studies to speak of, very few social interactions. When you think about it, it's a very good, very sobering and relevant situation to what many people may be experiencing today. Just really sad economic circumstances and this feeling of being trapped by poverty. Now, something that was interesting that I read about this book, because one thing to know about it is it feels fast-paced, but plot-wise, there's not a lot happening in the first part. And in part, this is because the original idea for this novel was another book called The Drunkards, which was going to be about alcoholism in Russia. And so there is a character that gets introduced in this first part named Marmeladov. Hope I'm saying that right. Who is a drunkard and alcoholic. And Raskolnikov, the student, meets Marmeladov, the drunkard, in a tavern and listens to his sad story of his rise and his downfall, succumbing to drink and ruining his family's lives, who were already in pretty poor straits. Hi, Charles. Thanks for joining me. You read this novel straight through last week, 24 Hours Without Sleep in Tears for the Last Third. Well, let me tell you, I have already been, I'm almost a little embarrassed to say this, but I think I've cried 2 or 3 times already just in the first part of this book, and that probably has something to do with just being stressed out about other things, but honestly, this book really packs a lot of emotional punch. So I mentioned that he meets this drunkard in a tavern, and this Marmeladov gives him the most heart-wrenching story about how, he married this woman who was a widow with children, I believe, and she was thinking that if she married this guy who I think was some kind of government official, if she married him, she'd be able to save herself from poverty. But as it turns out, Marmeladov, being an alcoholic, just squandered all of his chances, ruined every prospect he had at employment, and got to the point where it basically drove his wife over the edge. And she turns to Marmeladov's daughter, Sonia, and says, "What are you doing just, sponging off the family? Why don't you do..." And she basically goads Sonia into becoming a prostitute. It's just, I remember when I first read this, I was very, obviously put off by that whole scene, but when you read it again as, I think, an older person, because I think I was a teenager at the time, but when you read it with a little more understanding of the historical context and a little more insight on, I guess you could say the power or the curse of poverty, it's just heart-wrenching. And Sonia, who is, I think, intended to be a character with a very good heart, she does exactly what her stepmother tells her to do, and she goes and prostitutes herself. And the way, things are back then, once you've done it once, you are essentially condemned to that life, because everybody knows that you've done that, and you are basically branded as a prostitute for the rest of your life. And it gets to the point where you actually register as a prostitute. You have to get this yellow card, so called. And yeah, it's a very sudden downfall in this official's life. So Raskolnikov, going back to the student, he's listening to this and getting more and more depressed, and he ends up visiting this family and seeing the extent to which they have fallen. It's just very tragic, very, very tragic. So that was the first tearjerker in the book, and you can see where, just by virtue of having spent so much time on this family story, you can see where Dostoevsky was still trying to explain his original idea for the novel. Like, these characters, this family, was clearly very important to Dostoevsky, as, you know, whatever that first draft was, and he wanted to keep that in here. And I think it doesn't slow down the book at all. If anything, it pulls you in even further. Now, I will say the first time I read this novel, I can't remember getting very far at all. I think I probably made it to chapter 4 or 5 and I stopped because it was very depressing. But again, being older now, I think it's a little, no, it's not necessarily easier to read, but I understand it so much better than when I was younger. The next thing that really happens that drives a stake into Raskolnikov's heart, so to speak, and not in a vampire way, but like just truly soul-shattering. He receives this letter from his mother, and he's been out of touch with his family for a while, but he has a mother and a sister who have been attempting to support him as a student. And he learns of this whole scandal that had occurred with his sister Dunya, and how she had been employed as a governess, but her employer, the father of the children, was being predatory towards her and caused an enormous scandal. And, you know, it being the 1800s, naturally, Dunya was suspected of being, you know, the villain in this scandal. Anyway, there was a huge kerfuffle in that town, and it did end up getting cleared up. But again, and this was really quite a sobering commentary on women's roles in the 1800s, but even though the scandal was cleared up, Raskolnikov's sister Dunya is still put in this vulnerable position of having had the scandal be associated with her name. And even though her name was cleared, she just feels like, okay, now what? Like, I can't be a governess there anymore. What's left? And just a feeling of desperation and worry about her mother and her brother. And she ends up getting a marriage proposal from this complete stranger who, I want to say he is also a government official. Actually, I'm not really sure, but he has a good position in life. He's very wealthy, and he wants to marry her, but they don't know each other very well. And, you know, I think they've met him like once or twice, and he's very controlling. At least that's the vibe he's giving off. He's just a very arrogant person. He mentions how he wants to marry a woman who needs him in an economic sense, and just really giving off these red flags and bad vibes altogether. And you can imagine how sick Raskolnikov feels when he hears that his sister has accepted this guy, and the mother is trying to put sort of a rosy veneer over the situation. So yeah, I mean, just plenty of bad news, frankly, for the student. A really famous quote from the book about Sonya, actually. They're making the most of it. They've wept over it and grown used to it. Man grows used to everything, the scoundrel. So that's one side. The next thing he says, and I think this is important. Usually you hear the first part of the quote, man can grow used to anything, the villain or the scoundrel. But the next thing he says is, what if I am wrong? What if man is not really a scoundrel, man in general, I mean, the whole race of mankind? Then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and it's all as it should be. And this is where you start to get the interesting literary layers to Crime and Punishment, because Raskolnikov, whose name actually means... I've heard his name described as having a couple of different meanings. I've heard that it means like a schism or a divide or either or. And here you can see that happening in his mind. He's like, well, either there is a moral standard by which I should be upset at what's happening with my sister and what happened to Sonia. Either there's that, or, maybe I shouldn't be worried about it. Maybe this is just the way things are. I guess taking more of an amoral stance to it, sort of like, what's his name? Sort of like Wolf Larson from The Sea Wolf by Jack London. I really enjoyed that, and I think that's one of those situations where reading the quote in context really adds a lot to it. I think, too, what really struck me about the subplot with his sister was how the mother responded to it. So in the case of Sonia and her stepmother, there's obviously a very negative interaction there. Sonia feels bullied by her stepmother into taking this terrible decision to become a prostitute. And whereas Dunya, she's made the decision, but it's kind of an illusion of a decision with the support of her mother. Her mother playing this weird kind of supportive role, but it's kind of a passive-aggressive role, I would say. I think a good mother would tell her daughter not to do this under any circumstances. In fact, Raskolnikov even says at one point, this is not the sister I know. This is not something she would have done years ago. So clearly there's a lot more going on under the surface and between the lines, which is not explicit here because we're only learning about it through this letter. And I liked that because not only is it just immersing you in the story, but when you have to hear it through a letter like Raskolnikov, you become weighted down by that sense of detachment, just like he is, and you start to feel the powerlessness that he feels as well. All of this, by the way, is just brilliant writing, and I would say fairly intentional, right? I mean, there's many ways you could have built up this whole first part, right? And I suppose some people would say there's just not much action going on. It's a bunch of conversations and letters, but I think it's so effective because what Dostoevsky is doing is immersing you in Raskolnikov's point of view and making you truly empathize with his situation, which is essential for what happens next. All right, so at one point, so he's already met Marmeladov's family. But Sonia wasn't there when he met them. there is a scene shortly after all this that he meets a woman of the street, and we say woman, but she was really just a teenage girl. And probably this is Sonya. This is either Sonya or a representation of Sonya. And I would say this was a very powerful scene as well, because he comes across this girl and she's already probably inebriated, trying to escape the life that she lives. And she's clearly fallen on hard times. Based on the way she's dressed, he can tell she hasn't always lived this life. And he feels this sense of protection towards her, because that's the side of Raskolnikov that still believes in morals and justice and, protecting the vulnerable. And he sees another guy across the street who's watching this girl predatorially, and so Raskolnikov alerts a policeman and tries to get him to intervene. But by the end of the scene, he's kind of gone back to his apathetic attitude. So again, caught between these two sides. I think one side is caring a lot, caring to the point of just feeling utterly crushed, and the other side is not caring at all, because if he cares, it's just too overwhelming, and what can you do about it anyway, sort of a thing. Hello, Possible Pilot. Yeah, this is a very impromptu live stream. I didn't really plan on doing it, but I wanted to talk about Crime and Punishment a little bit before the week started. I just sort of wanted to get my thoughts down somewhere. And I'm going through part 1. So over the past, 30 minutes or so, I've talked about the characters that are introduced, and particularly Raskolnikov, the main character, who has this conflict inside of him, basically the moral side and the amoral side, the side that wants to fight the system that he's in, and the side that wants to just turn a blind eye to it or to participate it in an amoral sense. So those are some of the main characters. Raskolnikov, the student, his sister Dunya, about to essentially prostitute herself off to a husband she doesn't even know. Sonya, a girl who has actually been forced into the street by her stepmother, and Marmeladov, Sonya's father, who is an alcoholic. Very, very tragic beginning. So shortly after this, Raskolnikov has this dream, which is a bit of it's not really clear if it's a dream or a flashback. It seems like a flashback, but I think it could go, I guess you could interpret it either way, but he's back in his childhood town, and his father is with him. They're walking down the street, and they pass this tavern, which is just overfilled with people drinking and just getting way out of control. Again, going back to Dostoevsky's original idea for the novel, a novel that would have been called The Drunkards. Clearly, this is another one of those motifs that maybe he wanted to use in that first version, or maybe it came to mind as he was writing this, that he wanted to continue to highlight alcoholism as a major issue. So little Raskolnikov and his father walking down the street, and they come across this tavern. Outside the tavern, a horse pulling a cart, and the owner of the horse comes out. He's raving drunk, and he says, "I can make this horse gallop." And the horse, by the way, is already on its last legs, literally. But the drunk owner piles into the cart, piles all these people from the tavern into the cart, and they're abusing this horse, trying to get it to run, and the horse, of course, can't run at all. And then they get out and they murder the horse. They just start beating it up till it's dead. So it's really dark flashback. And oh yeah, this was a line I highlighted from that scene. So of course the boy Raskolnikov is just terrified by the crowd, and he runs over the horse and he tries to, comfort the horse. But his father takes him away and says, "They are drunk, they are brutal, it's not our business." Which I guess you could say is just a metaphor for everything that is being experienced in his early adulthood. But it was, like I said, I think I mentioned it already. I cried a few times in this first part. That was one of those parts. I think there's just something so visceral about Dostoevsky's writing. It's not like he's not graphic in the sense of a 21st century author. He's not like that at all. I think what he does portray very graphically is people's emotions and I don't know, just the raw actions of people. Sometimes that's all you need. You don't need to get in grotesque detail, but people's imaginations are pretty good at filling in those gaps. It's funny because so we've talked about how there's this desire in him to change the world, to make it better, to save his sister. And then there's like the other side of him, which is like, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. I'm going to let people just dig their own graves and, So the dream, in spite of his father's words about saying it's not their business, the dream actually sort of brings him to his senses for a minute, which is a curious contradiction to what happens a little later when he thinks about, this idea of fate. So another layer that Dostoevsky plays with here is, are things fated to be? Do you have free will, or is it fate that you hear this conversation, or you go and murder the woman who has the money? Like, because at one point he overhears other people talking about murdering the same woman. And I don't think I've gotten to that quite yet. Not quite yet. We'll get there pretty soon. But he seems to ask you whether you believe in these things being fated to be. For example, Raskolnikov happens to hear a time when this old woman will be alone. This old woman, by the way, is basically... she lives alone, but she does have this half-sister or stepsister who she lives with. And the sister, Lizaveta, she doesn't seem capable of taking care of herself, so she lives with the old woman. But the old woman basically treats her almost like a slave. She expects her to do all of the housework and wait on her hand and foot, essentially. So... again, this old woman's not a very nice person at all, and this sister deals with the brunt of it pretty much every day. Anyway, Raskolnikov overhears that the sister, who's usually with her a lot, is one day going to be visiting someone else. So the old woman will be alone on this day at this particular time in the morning. So he takes note of that. Okay, so then it's just after that he hears the conversation between another student and an officer, I guess a soldier, who are talking about murdering that same woman. And this is where Dostoevsky is like classic Dostoevsky. He goes into this long conversation between the two and pulls out, I guess it's not that long. It's not really that long, but it certainly goes into these philosophical questions of, if one person dies but 100 people's lives get better, is it moral? Is it justified to murder that person? And so that's basically what they're debating. And the student, of course, I guess you could say the student is a bit of a shadow character to Raskolnikov. So he expresses Raskolnikov's feeling that, it would be fine to murder the woman because, we'd save all these families from poverty. We could, redistribute her wealth to them. We could release them of their debts to her. Girls like Sonia wouldn't be going out in the street. There's just all these justifications he's building up. And then so the soldier asks him, well, would you do it yourself personally? And the student is like, no. He says it has nothing to do with me. And then the soldier says, if you would not do it yourself, there's no justice about it. And as we were talking about this together, me and my brother, I think we kind of concluded that what he's saying is you can't justify something if you're not willing to put your own self on the line, if you're not willing to back it up by actions. So you can say whatever you want, but if you don't actually do it, if you don't think it's truly just to the point that you would do it yourself, then you're not being sincere, or you're not demonstrating the justice in it. Which also kind of made me think about this Alfred Hitchcock movie called Rope, in which they have a similar conversation, the characters, about the validity of murder. But as my brother pointed out, that's a little bit different because in that movie, they don't actually have any justification whatsoever in any which way. It's just sort of a murder done for the sake of it. Whereas here, the idea is that you'd be helping other people out. So, that was a really good point. And I would say that's about the extent of the comparison that could be made there. Except for the point of whether it's okay to even have those conversations, So you can fall on two sides of that fence, whether it's okay to talk about such things or whether you have a moral responsibility in your speech as well. So, that's a whole nother topic, but it certainly came to mind. All right, so the rest of part 1 is basically he's decided, he wakes up that morning and he decides to go through with the plan. And there's a couple of interesting things about this. Even though you could say this was all premeditated, it seems clear to me, or at least it seems increasingly plausible, that he's kind of lost his mind, because he's kind of flip-flopped back and forth so much up to this point that the moment of him deciding to do it is just as, it seems just as likely he would have changed his mind at that point. And the other thing is, he doesn't have very solid plans for this murder. He has a few ideas, like he's decided to carry an axe with him, of all things, hide it in his clothing. But, he hasn't made a plan for his escape. He hasn't made a plan for hiding the stuff that he steals from this woman. So, again, it all seems like a really bad thought experiment that he hasn't even, cold and calculatingly figured out ahead of time. So when it actually all goes down and he actually commits the murder, which is, by the way, one of the most chilling things I have read. And I've read Lord of the Flies. I read Blindness earlier this year, which was horrific. But I don't know, there was something about the way that this was all built up that was absolutely chilling. And I think it was in big part because we were inside Raskolnikov's head for so long. But I mean, I was reading this last night and I was just like terrified. Like, it was really scary. Because he has this whole plan about how he's gonna talk to the woman and trick her into, opening this package he has for her, and then he's got his axe, and it's so sickening. And it's, again, not graphically described, but the anxiety, and she can tell something's amiss because she's a very, very smart woman, and even though she knows her doom is upon her, there's like nothing she can do about it. She's completely helpless, and that's really scary. So and then another thing happens again. It's said in the title of this stream, but I am going to be revealing some minor spoilers. I guess, I don't know, are there really, I guess you could say the ending of this novel is going to be a spoiler, because I honestly don't know exactly how it ends. I just know vaguely how it ends. But anyway, I felt like I had to sort of go into this in detail. But no sooner has he murdered this old woman quite brutally, and you've sort of, I don't know, you've barely gotten over that moment, then the sister Lizaveta comes in and finds her, which was something he, again, hadn't planned or anticipated. And the irony of this whole situation is that he had factored Lizaveta into one of his motivations for the murder. Like, if I kill this old woman, I will save her half sister from further abuse. But when he sees Lizaveta, she's a witness, and not so much a witness, but she sees him with the murder weapon, and she sees the murdered woman, and he just, I don't know, he loses it again. Or you could say this is actually a calculated moment when he realizes he has to kill, well, I say has to, he has to, quote, kill this witness, and he does. In fact, her murder is even worse. Like, he uses the sharp end of the axe. Like, it is completely disgusting. And yeah, so this is a point where some other people show up, and I shouldn't laugh, but this was the point where I was like, okay, so he's just gonna start killing everybody in this apartment complex. Like, my goodness, like, this guy is just on a mad rampage. But actually, this is the point where he manages to slip out of the apartment complex and get away without slaughtering anybody else. But it's just a horrific scene. And in the hours following that, he's kind of in a daze. He just barely manages to clean himself up, clean up the murder weapon, put it back from where he stole it. He just barely manages to hide the money he's stolen and the other valuables in a really terrible hiding place, because he hasn't thought that through either. And that brings us to the end of part 1, I believe. Or maybe even a little bit past. I read chapter 1 of part 2 as well, but I think I will save all of that for next time. So yeah, that is a reaction slash summary of Crime and Punishment part 1. It's really kind of hard to react to this book, because on the one hand, it's just a endless stream of bad things and just horrifying stuff. And yet at the same time, it is pretty believable, I think. I don't know. I think maybe Raskolnikov has a bit more, like, we really do get inside his head, and I'm wondering I do wonder if he, I don't want to say idealized. I almost feel like he's almost too likable at the beginning and then just sort of kind of loses his humanity as it goes on. But then again, maybe that is also realistic. We shall see how he develops as a character. One thing I will say, going into part 2 here, is that he's already toying with the idea of turning himself in. So there's that. I think that's going back to that either or flip-flopping and his conscience that plagues him as well. He never seems to be able to delete his conscience, which is interesting. He, for one, doesn't seem to be a drunkard, which is another interesting fact. He doesn't seem to be addicted to any substances. You would think he'd be the one character in his right mind, but if anything, he seems to be just as distraught as everyone else. So, I don't know. Is he going to turn himself in? Is someone going to find the evidence of his crimes and turn him in? We will see. At this point, I could pretty much go either way, so don't tell me. For those of you who've read it before, I suspect he is going to get found out before he builds up the courage to turn himself in. But I don't know. Compared to, so I've read quite a few of other works by Dostoevsky. This is far more, I'd say this book is far easier to read than The Brothers Karamazov. So I don't know that it's the best introduction to Dostoevsky, because like I said, I tried to read this as my first before and didn't finish it. But maybe because I just wasn't in the right state of mind to be reading this kind of book, if there is a right state of mind. Yeah. Let me read some of this stuff from Wikipedia, this background section. So at the time that he was working on this, it says he owed large sums of money to creditors and was trying to help the family of his brother Mikhail, who had died in early 1864. So as a last resort, he turned to a publisher and asked for an advance on a proposed story. Originally, it was going to be a shorter work, like a novella, for a monthly journal. The journal was called The Russian Messenger, and it had also published Ivan Turgenev and Leo Tolstoy. This would be Dostoevsky's first publication in this journal. In a letter written to the publisher, Dostoevsky explained that Crime and Punishment was going to be about a man who yields to, quote, certain strange, unfinished ideas, yet floating in the air. He planned to explore the moral and psychological dangers of the ideology of radicalism and felt that the project would appeal to the conservative publisher. That's interesting. One thing I will say is that this book, for any commentary he might have had on radicalism or ideologies thereof, I don't really feel like this book approaches it in a political sense. It's not that kind of book. Everything so far has been extremely personal, except for maybe that one conversation between the student and the soldier. That one does kind of operate on a more philosophical level, but other than that, I don't think that Raskolnikov is conscious of participating in ideology or like he's not theorizing per se. This is all very much a specific and personal affair to him. And what is interesting, though, is you can see how if something starts out personal, it could indeed turn into something more political or ideological if you were to get involved with those things in that state of mind. But so far, that hasn't necessarily been the case. That this is a very well-crafted novel so far in that regard. Let's see. Is there anything else we should talk about? Let's see. Here's some more information from the section called Themes on Wikipedia. Dostoevsky's letter to the publisher reveals his immediate inspiration, a desire to counteract what he regarded as nefarious consequences arising from the doctrines of Russian nihilism. In the novel, Dostoevsky pinpointed the dangers of both utilitarianism and rationalism, the main ideas of which inspired the radicals, continuing a fierce criticism he had already started with his Notes from Underground. I did read Notes from Underground. It's been quite a long time. I need to read that again. I had tried rereading it recently, and I just thought it was really depressing the second time around, so there's that. Oh boy. He thus attacked a peculiar blend of French utopian socialism and Benthamite utilitarianism, which had developed under revolutionary thinkers such as Nikolai Chernyshevsky and became known as rational egoism. The radicals refused to recognize themselves in the novel's pages, since Dostoevsky pursued nihilistic ideas to their most extreme consequences. One of the social critics of the time ridiculed the notion that Raskolnikov's ideas could be identified with those of the radicals of the time. Yeah, interesting. I do think those themes are important to be aware of. What I would say is, thus far, I do feel like this can just be read as a novel, and you don't have to necessarily read it in any kind of political sense. And I do think the best literature is like that. You should be able to read it on more of a face value level. You can dig a little deeper if you want to. You can criticize Dostoevsky if you want to, but at the end of the day, it's still, at least so far, a very fascinating story and very well written so far. Oh, the other thing that I read somewhere was that originally it was going to be written in first person, sort of like Notes from Underground, which is interesting. I think that I think third person has actually worked out really well. And in spite of that, I feel very connected to the main character. And I think if we were to be reading it from first person, it would be almost too close. Although, I don't know. I would also have been interested in that too. But, Notes from Underground, for example, it has a very frantic, delirious kind of vibe to the narration. It is first person. And I don't think that would suit this book very well. I think this book, we really do need a bit of detachment from the main character. And so far, that seems to be working out really well. So, all right, I think that's all I had for this evening. I'm reading, Crime and Punishment. I'm still reading An African in Greenland, which I have right here. I'll just say a few words on this real quick. I am really liking this book so far. Oh, sorry, this is my sticky note. This is, I don't know if I mentioned it before at all on the channel, but this is a memoir by an author from Togo, a small country in Africa. It was written, I want to say I think it was published in the 80s, but this took place, I want to say, in like the 60s. And it's about this young boy growing up in Togo. True story, by the way, all true story. Who, comes from a very traditional family background, and he finds this book about the Inuits in Greenland and is completely fascinated by reading about their way of life. And he decides he's going to run away from home and go see what it's like in Greenland. And as crazy as that sounds, that is exactly what happened. So I'm about halfway through this. The first part of the book was about his childhood, his decision to leave Togo, his journeys in Europe, because it took him years to get to Greenland. I mean, this was it's not like today where you just get on a plane and you're at your destination in a day or two. No, this guy took years to save money, make connections, make progress on his journey. It was truly remarkable and inspiring. I mean, I have to admit, I give up on my goals a lot faster than that. He always had this goal in mind, and it's just amazing. So I've really been enjoying it so far. Not only is it a fascinating story, but he just is a brilliant writer. He has such a sense of humor. I find myself laughing out loud a lot. Even when his travels are not going as well as he would like, he just has a really good sense of humor about it. So really enjoying it. Halfway. So he's already visited the southern Greenland citizens, and then he's going to go up north and try to visit the Inuits who still use sled dogs, because that was something he really wanted to see. I'm sure I'll have more to say about this in the future, but really like it so far. Another good read by the New York Review Books publishers. And then the other thing that I'm going to be reading is The Great Gatsby, which I don't think I have on my desk here, but yeah, The Great Gatsby, we'll be reading that starting next week. It's a reread, and I'm sure I'll have stuff to say about that too. So yeah, that's all I had for this evening. Thanks to everyone who stopped by, and I will be seeing you again very soon, hopefully with part 2 of Crime and Punishment. Thanks for watching, and have a good evening.